Welcome to our continuing series of stories about Pensacola, Florida, North America's first-place city, the city of five flags. And in this series of episodes, we've been talking about how Pensacola people related to experiences in World War I. And in our most recent episode, we began by bringing some background materials on our president at that time, Woodrow Wilson, the academic and also the peacemaker, or trying to be the peacemaker of the world. We also mentioned the fact that we had the beginnings of assembly of men here in Pensacola. We talked about how A.C. Blood personally put together 2 infantry companies, and this was the beginning also of work by the American Red Cross, the YMCA, and others to help out as they could. Well, as we continue on, let's take a look today about how things were developing in terms of the community itself. What was the background of people, what people were doing here in Pensacola? One of the first things we would mention, there were a number of industries that were at work. We had a small shipyard operated by the Bruce Ollinger Company. There were 2 fertilizer companies. Newport Industries had just opened. And of course, we had the new Sacred Heart Hospital, which was fundamental to some of the things that were done here. Just towards the end of 1917, we added another industry. This became known as the Pensacola Shipyard. It had been put together by a local team of men plus outside investors, and the Pensacola Shipyard would serve well in Pensacola itself, and then all the way into the scope of World War II many years later. This was a time now when our Pensacola Aeronautical Station was coming into its own. It now was training people with fixed wing aircraft. It was training people in blimps and kites and all sorts of other lighter than aircraft. And by the time the end of 1917 came along, they had put more than 500 men through the training process, some of whom had already gone to Europe to serve with the French and the British aviators there. We had the Navy Yard, of course, was a very active place, and by the time we got to the end of 1917, it had many more civilian employees, many of whom, of course, had to transport out there every day. Pensacola still had what they called the dummy line, an electrified streetcar sort of transit that took people out there. And also, by the end of 1917, we had opened up a ferry service. This meant that twice a day a ferry boat would leave from Pensacola Pier, Palafox Street Pier, and go to the Navy and then bring people back at night. It was a gas-saving and time-saving affair. Through this particular period, Pensacola people began to recognize that they had a stake in the war more than just as observers. Because by the time we got to the end of 1917, we saw a great number of homes in the community that had flags flying in there, American flags, backed up by a separate flag in which a star would appear, a blue star for someone who was actually in the service from that family. And later on, when there were casualties, the blue star would be changed to a gold star. And this, of course, was a practice that went on. And the churches themselves began to do the same thing. One church, for example, by the time we got to the end of 1917, had 27 men in the service. So they created their own American flag with 27 stars in it instead of the standard ones for the various states. It all made things more personal. By the time we got to the end of 1917, the United States had more than 900,000 men in uniform, and the 42nd Division had arrived in France. Now, 42nd was putting together a troop of people that would become very famous. Many of them would appear in motion pictures sometime later. And by now, of course, General John J. Pershing was in charge of the affairs in France. And he was being aided now by some men whose names would become household words 30 years later when World War II proceeded. These were men like Generals Eisenhower, Patton, and Bradley, all of whom were serving there. And of course, the flight of people from West Point, many of whom had been graduates of the class of 1915, certainly went on to greater glory after that. As we proceeded, of course, we were reaching a point now where it was necessary to pay for the war. And the cost was mounting astronomically as more people were trained and put in uniform. And as this proceeded, of course, the need came along for the public to participate. And so we went through the beginning of a sale of what became known as Liberty bonds. And the bonds were sold in various denominations. And of course, one of the first things that they wanted to do here was to make sure that someone was out in front trying to sell them and would be become participants themselves. And the brand new Rotary Club, which had been here just about 2 years at this time, took the lead in being the sponsors of this kind of Liberty Bond sale, and they themselves subscribed and purchased more than $350,000 worth of the bond, a rather considerable sum at that particular point. As this was going on, of course, we have the Red Cross, the Salvation Army, the Knights of Columbus, and groups of this kind who wanted to be a part of the war and be helpful. So each one of them began to have their own fundraising campaigns to put together things here that would benefit particularly the men and women in service. And the Red Cross and Salvation Army particularly put together campaigns so that they would quickly go across the water with our men in Europe. And the Salvation Army itself had a wonderful slogan, which had a great appeal, of course, as they were saving money, or raising money. Basically, they were saying, "We'll be with your boy over there." And of course, this slogan caught on and was well respected. As all of this proceeded, men, and particularly men who are in the service, were sent overseas. They were seeing what was going on in the trenches, even though our own men were not fully involved in this yet. But these men saw what they could, and then they came back. And they were very helpful locally here, because these men would come back. They were well publicized in the local paper, and then they would go on a speaking tour. They would go to the various, well, there weren't many civic, they'd go to the various clubs, the churches, and others, and the government agencies, put on public information displays to tell people what it was like over there, how difficult it was, but how important it was, since the Allies, the French and the British, were really not doing particularly well at this point. As we moved into 1918, in fact, they were doing rather badly. Now, by this time, of course, we were recognizing full scale that food is extremely important in a war. And we mentioned in our last episode how people here had begun to be encouraged to do more in the way of raising food and then saving food. And by the time we get into the latter part of 1917, into the new year of 18, those efforts were paying off. Places like the San Carlos Hotel, for example, made a big thing of saying, we know that it's important to have good food, and we want to be sure our local patrons are well served, but we're going to do this in a way that we have portion control. We will be sure that we never waste anything that we serve. This was when the breadless Wednesdays and the meatless Tuesdays and this sort of thing became a part of the hotel and restaurant service, but also was part of what people did at home. They were saving as they possibly could. Well, by the time we get into the early part of 1918, the new Pensacola Shipyard is beginning to turn out its first efforts. Now, this yard was very unique. It had started on a piece of ground that was just a few isolated pine trees. This was on the east bank of Bayou Chico. Nothing had stood there. In fact, we have some wonderful photos that illustrate that this was really virgin land as far as construction of a shipyard was concerned. These people moved in, stripped the land, and began putting together the buildings that they needed, and then, of course, the barracks that they needed, because as they moved forward, beginning in the middle of 17 and then well into 18, that shipyard employed over 1,000 people. That was a very major employer for the Pensacola area. Now, it was so important to the federal program at this time that the United States Army sent 100 men here in uniform to be the guards of that shipyard. And the shipyard itself was a kind of a cooperative effort. It had to be put together so quickly. And people cooperated. The county putting in streets and roads, the city providing for traffic controls, and Newport Industries, which was the neighbor actually of the shipyard, they made it possible for the new shipyard to use the wells that Newport had dug so that they didn't have to spend time putting together a water source, and that worked out fine. So everyone was working together. And by the time we get to the end of middle of 1918, this yard has 6 keel bases in progress, and they are now turning out they have on the waves at this point merchant ships of considerable size, 600 or 700 feet. They had seagoing tugboats, and they had seagoing barges, all of which were needed very badly by not only the military but also by our commercial shippers, because in the years just leading up to World War I, our merchant marine had sort of settled down. The British and the Greeks had pretty much taken over that field internationally, and we had to race to catch up. And this shipyard was one of those that was doing the job here in the United States. And incidentally, it shows you that we don't learn lessons from history sometimes, because the United States faced exactly the same problem when World War II began, and we had to reactivate and build ships as fast as we possibly could. Well, we move, as I say, we move into 1918, and at this point in time, we're seeing the results of things happening in Europe itself. One of the big things that, of course, was a major problem for the Allies was that beginning in the middle of 1917, and then by the end of that year, the Russians had literally collapsed. The Bolshevik revolution had taken charge in Russia, and the new rulers in that country made peace with the Germans. That meant, of course, that the Germans could take all of the troops that had been involved on that Eastern Front and shift them to the Western Front, where the Germans thus had another great block of military people with experience. It was at this same time, of course, that another element developed in Russia, because there was a second side, aside from what became later what we call the Communist Party. These were people who wanted a revolution, but they didn't want a socialist government there. So they became known as the White Russians. The others on the Bolshevik side became known as the Red Russians. And of course, immediately some of the Allies, including the United States, wanted to be sure, if they possibly could, that the Reds did not win. So one of the less publicized facts of World War I history, including some men that were present from Pensacola, these became a U.S. satellite, and these men were shipped over to the northern coast of Russia and went into battle against the Red Russians. That's a long additional story. We just want to put it on the record, the fact that Pensacola people were involved as we fought in the Red Russian, White Russian War of that time. In the war itself, on the European continent, things continued to go badly for the Allies. And at this point, of course, what had been happening from the very beginning of the arrival of our people in Europe was that General Pershing insisted that the United States people, the United States Army people, they were going to be kept together, they were going to be trained together, and they were going to fight as a unit. He didn't want to split off some here and some there to bolster up the French and British armies. So with very few exceptions, and there were a few exceptions early in 1918, most of the American people were kept together as a unit. And in the next episode, our final episode of this series, we'll bring back some of the facts of where these men went, how they fought, and how successful they were in some of the great battles of that war. Well, as the war began to wear down, now we began to see the success of some of the things that were being done by the service organizations, the Red Cross, the Salvation Army, the other. Because by the time we get into the March or April of 1918, there were casualties coming back to our country, casualties from the battlefield. Some of these, of course, were being sent to the Naval Hospital at the Aeronautical Station, and it was here that the Red Cross really did shine, because they had prepared volunteers to do this sort of work, and they had done it extremely well. And basically, these men and women were anxious to do their part, just as the Salvation Army, the Knights of Columbus, everyone wanted to do his help, whether it was raising money, folding bandages, raising, as the 4-H people said, raise another hog or two, whatever it took to try to be part of it. And Pensacola's people were like that. And as a result, we can say, looking back, that our community certainly was a participant of that kind. Of course, as we come down toward the early part of spring in 1918, the war is getting very serious, and people here are becoming more serious themselves. They recognize that we are not going to win easily in Europe, even though we thought we might. So as we leave that particular scene, we want to say, everybody realize that war is serious business for everyone.